So what are we talking about? We are talking about, I'm going to use several words that mean a little bit different, but I'm going to use them interchangeably. I want to talk about ideologies, worldviews, religions, or stories. And I'm going to use the word story. And what I mean by that is, let me flip over here. We all make sense of our world through certain stories, scripts, narratives, worldviews, systems of belief. All those words are very synonymous, trying to describe that everybody, you have it consciously or you have it unconsciously, but nobody lives a random life. Everybody's living their life making sense of what's happening around them through one lens or another. A lens, that's another way to talk about a worldview. Now, some of these stories, worldviews, lenses, are true. And in other words, they reflect reality and they help you successfully navigate through life because they are true. Some stories, almost all stories, have a little piece of truth in them. Even lies, typically, a good lie has a little bit of truth in it. But in general, some stories are true. Some stories contain a grain of truth, but they're incorrect. And those kinds of stories, sooner or later, lead you into conflict and trouble making sense of the world. When you think of myth, you probably think of ancient Greek or Roman myths. Or here's a great myth for you, is the Babylonian creation myth in the Enuma Elish. So this is like, 4,000 years ago. And so they came up with the idea that the world was created, and it was created by a god, and one god killed another god and dismembered their body, and out of that portions of the body comes the universe and people and everything we know. Well, that story contains a little bit of truth as far as I'm concerned, and that is this world was created. It didn't happen by accident. But nothing else in that story is accurate, right? And we call that a myth. Some stories are intentionally untrue, and we call those stories lies. I'll give you a great example of one of those. In North Korea, official name is the People's Democratic Republic of Korea. Not one of those things is actually accurate. And their story of that nation has a lot to do with the divinity of Kim Jong-un and his father Kim Jong-il and his grandfather. That's a story, I'm going to argue, is intentionally untrue for the purpose of manipulating people. So you have different kinds of stories. You have true stories, you have stories that are incorrect and they're myths, and then you have stories that are lies. And so we're going to look at some of these stories. Some of them contain more truth than others. Some of these stories lead to a great deal of anxiety in confronting the world because they don't match. They don't successfully navigate you and make sense of your world. In our last lesson, and this was going to be our starting point, I gave you the Christian story. So the Christian story, and this is kind of a short version of the Christian story, is that we were created by God in His image. That sentence alone says huge implications. We rebelled against God. This is the doctrine or the idea of sin, and we broke our relationship with Him and with each other. And that incident is basically the doctrine or the teaching or the idea of a fallenness of humanity. Humanity is not what we were intended to be. There is a wrongness in the world. Because He loves us, think John 3:16, the official verse of all sporting events, God paid the price for us to be reconciled to Himself and to one another. That is the doctrine or the story of the gospel. The word gospel means good news, and so that is the good news, that because He loves us, God paid the price for us to be reconciled to Him. Consequently, the implications is we are no longer slaves to sin, but live as a new creation in Christ. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the story, the Christian story. And I don't mean story as a made-up thing. I mean story as a worldview, as an ideology, as a system of beliefs, as a bunch of statements about what is actually true. So that story is what Christ followers believe. This is how we understand and interact with the world. A couple of interesting things. That has some interesting implications about justice. In the Christian story, justice is a thing in itself. There are things that are inherently just and there are things that are inherently unjust. There are huge implications for the idea of truth. The Christian story believes that there is such a thing as truth with a capital T, absolute truth, things that are true all the time, in every circumstance, through all time. That is not the case with all the stories, but so I want to point out a couple things. One other thing for us in America is that the United States of America was founded in the context of this story. That is a historical fact. I'm not arguing like how many of the founders were Christians and how many were deists and that kind of thing. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something that just is pretty incontrovertible, and that is that the assumptions and the principles of the founding of this country were done in the context of this story. Now you may say that's a good thing, that's a bad thing. That's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm just making the observation that this country, the institutions in this country were created in the context of this story. Hold that thought. That's going to explain why you're so angry at your TV set sometimes, okay? Because this is the story that has architected most of the institutions in America. So in this lesson, I want to talk about another major world view, another story, if you will. I want to talk about Marxism in its various forms. I want to talk about Karl Marx, not because he has a great impact on your life directly, because you do not live in China, you do not live in Russia, in which case he would have a very big impact directly on your life, but he is the grandfather of the modern secular story. In Europe, particularly the Western nations, there is a coalescing of secular ideology, what you might think of as secular humanism, like there is no God, man is the measure of all things, humanity is ultimately perfectible. This is a secular story, and it has coalesced around certain key ideas and become a very coherent modern secular religion, story, worldview, ideology, plug in whatever word you want. So I want to go back and I want to just take you through a little bit of history to get where we are today, and I think this will make a lot of things that are going on today, at least you can say, I understand why that is happening, okay? So let's go back to the 1800s. Let's start with Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin lived, you can see there when he lived, 1809 to 1882. He's most famous for publishing The Origin of Species, and he published some other things, but this is probably the most famous of his in 1859. Charles Darwin came upon, he's not the only one, but he's the first one, and he gets the credit, come upon a big idea. And it really has two parts, and it's really pretty simple. And that is, he made this observation of the way things are, and he said organizations seem to change through random mutation. In other words, as organisms perpetuate themselves, all kinds of organisms, they change randomly by mutations. Well, that's not particularly controversial, frankly. I mean, that in and of itself is more of an observation than an assertion. Here's the interesting part. Well, given these mutations and the fact that they are random, how do you know which one of these mutations is going to be picked up, if you will, and carried on through all the rest of the dinosaurs in that legacy, right? And how do you know which ones of these are going nowhere? Kind of an evolutionary cul-de-sac, if you will. This was his biggest idea. And this is a theory. It's why it's called the theory of evolution. Let me say a word about theories before we go on. A theory, because I really want us to think rationally and scientifically about these things. A theory is an assertion that has yet to be proven to be true. And yet, it is typically in science strong enough so that you are trying to prove or disprove it. It is a viable suggestion, if you will. The reason you'll hear things called theory, for example, in the social sciences, is because it brings a little bit of a scientific cachet with it. In other words, you think of a theory as, oh, that's pretty certain. Well, maybe, maybe not. So the idea that he had that's theoretical, that's mostly theoretical, is he said the way you can tell which one of these changes or mutation is going to pass on to the kids and the kids' kids and the great-grandkids is through a process called natural selection. Natural selection is an unguided process. I mean, there's no God in any of this. There's no direction. There's no Buddhist intelligence of the universe. There's nothing in this. It's called survival of the fittest commonly. It's called natural selection, survival of the fittest. So how do you know which ones of these random mutations move on down the line? That is all a matter of competition. It is a competing, organisms compete against each other to see the strongest will procreate. The strongest will survive, okay? That is a very controversial idea in the sense that, is that a sufficient mechanism to explain from an if you're a Darwinist, here's your big question. Is natural selection a sufficient reason to say that's how you get everything that you see? Is a bunch of people competing with each other to see who is going to have the most children, grandchildren, etc. But this idea of natural selection really caught on in people's minds because they looked around and they looked at Mother Nature and they said, you know what, life is a big old competition. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there, right? It's a survival of the fittest kind of a world. And particularly before the 21st century, if you looked at the world, it was definitely a competition for survival, for scarce resources, etc. So this idea caught on. Not only did it catch on in biology, it caught on in the social sciences as well. And so you have what is called social Darwinism. Not just, Darwin's theory is a biological theory. It's a conjecture to say, I think I would like to explain how everything got here by this. So it's a good story, interesting story. But then the social sciences picked it up and said, if we're animals, and this is how we got here, and natural selection, survival of the fittest, is the mechanism that's causing us to be successful in life or not successful in life, then that should be applied to the social world, social Darwinism. You know social Darwinism best by the word eugenics. And so by the end of the 1800s and definitely into the early 1900s, all through Europe, in the United States, you see kinds of social Darwinism, which said, you know, the strongest ought to survive. So for example, you see things like in England, for example, they felt like the aristocracy were superior, the strongest, the fittest, and should survive, and the commoners were not. And so they would talk about, have you ever heard of phrenology? Kind of looking at the bumps on your head, and that's supposed to tell you how fit you are, what kind of human being you are. You're more intelligent if your head's shaped a certain way, you're less if they're not. That's a form of eugenics. It's a way of reinforcing the superiority of certain people over other people. In the United States and other places, it took the form of forced sterilization. Now, that's not something you think about today, but that's something that happened in this country. Is there were people who were sterilized so they could not reproduce because they were considered in some way not the fittest. They were deficient in some way. This happened. And then, of course, at its most extreme, the Nazis practiced eugenics in the sense that, and they took this really seriously, and they said, we are the master race, we are the fittest, therefore we will eliminate the weak. What are they doing? They're playing out Mother Nature. And this is social Darwinism. So this idea of competition, this idea of the fittest trying to survive and the stronger surviving, is an idea that really caught on in the 1800s and comes down to us today. Second individual also lived in the 1800s. His name is Frederick Nietzsche. Nietzsche was not a biologist. Nietzsche is a philosopher, an extremely influential philosopher. Even though most people do not know his name, most secular thinking owes a great deal to him. He is the father of postmodernism, if you've heard about postmodernism, and I'll tell you why. You're going to hear some things that click with you. So Nietzsche took this idea, and he said, you know what? Life is really about survival of the fittest. It's a struggle. It's a competition. And you know what? For example, one of his books, he wrote a lot of books. One is Beyond Good and Evil. And here's what Nietzsche says. He says, in this kind of a Darwinian world, in this kind of a survival of the fittest, the strong survive, good and evil are made up ideas. And he said, you know who made up the idea of good and evil? The weak people. Because they're trying to keep the strong people from dominating them. And that's the way the world is supposed to work. That's who we are, that's what we are. And so Nietzsche is famous for basically saying that good and evil, for example, are a social construct. Now, he didn't use those words, but that's the words you'll hear today. What is a social construct? A social construct is something we make up. It's not real. We just made it up. He said good and evil is a social construct. You'd like to believe there's such a thing as good and evil, but there's not. He probably agreed with the great Greek historian Thucydides, lived about 400 years before Jesus, and he looked around at his world and he said this: the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. The strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. Nietzsche would say, you got it. That's exactly the way the world works. It's all a competition. It's all survival of the fittest. He coined the term will to power. He said, what is the meaning of our lives? The point of our lives is get as much power as you can. Be as strong as you can, because that's who survives. And that's all that is meaningful in this world. He's famous for saying God is dead and we have killed him, meaning we don't need God anymore. We see the world the way it really is. How does he see the world? In a very Darwinian kind of a way. This is a powerful idea that caught on. Okay? So let's come to Karl Marx. Also lived in the 1800s, also steeping with this same tea bag, if you will. This is an idea whose time had come in the 1800s. I'm not telling you everybody agrees with this. I'm just telling, I want you to see where this comes from, and we'll quickly fast forward to today. Karl Marx completely agreed with the idea that all of life is a struggle, and it's all about who has the power, and it's all about getting the power. Survival of the fittest. Is there a good and evil? No, not particularly. There's just strong and weak. There's just oppressor and oppressed. So he too bought into this, but he did it in economic terms. What Karl Marx basically said was, look at all of history, and you can understand the interaction of people with one another by looking at economic survival of the fittest. He thought that all history could be understood in economic terms. And he thought that history divided itself into two basic classes. You have the workers, the people that actually do the work, called the proletariat. And you have the people that own the factories and take advantage of the people that do the work. Wait a minute, that sounds really a lot like where I worked. You know, maybe that is true, just kidding. Seriously, and they're called the bourgeoisie. So basically, you have these two classes, and they're always warring with one another. And so he said that all of history can be understood by the survival of the fittest in economic terms, and he is famous for coming up with this idea, the idea of what we now call socialism and communism. In our next lesson, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about Russia. I want to talk about China. I want to talk about Mao Zedong. I want to talk about Lenin and Stalin. And I'd like to educate us a little bit about what happened if you live out those social Darwinist ideas as Marx applied them to economics. What does that lead to? That's still influencing our world in the East today. China and the South China Sea, why are they doing what they're doing? This is going to be very helpful to understand that. Russia and Vladimir Putin, why is he continuing to conquer countries through the Balkans and to the West? This will help us understand why. This idea is all about the weak being dominated by the strong. And you say, gosh, that just sounds so mean. That just sounds so wrong. I want you to understand, in this kind of thinking, that's not wrong. That's reality. This is what this story is about. Is that making sense? I want us to understand where is this coming from, and then a lot of things that are happening will make perfect sense to us. So, the idea of socialism and communism. Now, what did Marx say? Did he say, hey, it's a dog-eat-dog world and you should listen to my ideas? No. These kinds of stories always have a happy ending. Communism, today, for those who know what it is, say, wow, that is a not very good place to live. But that's not how it was built. It was built as a utopia. It was built in this way. It was said, look, you've got this class of people economically dominating this class of people, and what I want to do is mix them all up. We're going to overthrow the bad guys, the guys that are in control, and then we're all going to share and share alike, and it's going to be a utopia. Everybody's going to like living there. It's going to be fair to everybody. Everybody has the same thing, etc. We're going to fix the problems in history. Okay? Hold that thought. So that's what he said in an economic sense. Well, the interesting thing about that is that also got translated into the social realms. In other words, that's an economic theory. Remember, Marx had a biological theory that key idea then said, well, if that's who we are, that should affect how we work with each other. It led to eugenics. It led to the idea of differences amongst different groups of people. I'm going to try to talk about slavery as little as possible because that's an American thing. I mean, we need to talk about that. But I really am trying to give you a bigger world view. But people have dominated other people a lot in history. Social Darwinism, and I'm not blaming Darwin for this idea was applied to say, you know what, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's the way the world works. The strong dominate the weak. The fittest survive. And so these people, whether they are Australian Aborigines, whether they are Africans in Africa, whether they are the Serbs being dominated by the Croatians, whether they are the Hutus being dominated by the Tutsis, whatever it is, people applied that idea and said, we are more fit than they, therefore they are inferior beings. Does that make sense? That's how that idea got applied from that biological sense. Well, the same thing happened with Marx. Marx says life is a constant struggle economically, and the only way to fix it is revolution. The workers must rise up and kick out the people who are in charge. The only way for you to have a good life is a violent overthrow. This is communism. This is communism. This is Russia 1918. Violent overthrow of the people that are oppressing you. It's the only way to make your life better. So that economic theory also gets applied to social senses. Now, let's fast forward. We have now fast forwarded to modern times. So I'll stop for a second. I probably have gone too fast for you to ask questions. But I brought you up, ideal-wise, to modern times. And now I want you to see why some of the things you are seeing in the news, this is the story. And it's going to make a lot of sense. I'm not saying you're going to agree with it or disagree with it. That's not my purpose here. My purpose is for you to say, I see where this is coming from. Question?
You said Marx had a biological theory. Did you mean to say Darwin had a biological theory?
Yes, I did. I'm sorry if I misspoke. Darwin had a biological theory. that applied to social sciences, and Marx had an economic theory. If I misspoke, you know what I meant. In fact, just fill in the blanks of anything that I say that doesn't make sense. I would appreciate it if you could just fill in the blanks there. No, that's right.
Okay. Can you now or at some point in this talk about Christian nationalism?
Christian nationalism. Yes. Yes. The question is, can we talk about Christian nationalism? And maybe the best point, because I want to argue, and we're stopping educating, and I'm going to give you a conclusion out of my head. You may agree, you may disagree. I'm going to argue that Christian nationalism is an aberration of the Christian story. And it has been influenced by this story. So when I get to the end of this story, don't let me forget to say, now do you see where Christian nationalism comes from? Yes, thank you.
Okay. And are you going to tell us what intersectionality means?
Yes, thank you for asking. What is intersectionality? Okay, so today you're going to hear a lot of terms, but you now know all the ideas behind all these terms. So it seems complicated. You know why? Some things are complicated for two reasons. Some ideas are just really complicated. They're beautiful, they're complicated, they're intricate. Most things are complicated because of jargon. Okay? People say a lot of words, you don't know what those words mean, but the idea is not that bad. You now know everything to understand intersectionality and critical theory. I'm not telling you that the people that study that won't write a lot of other stuff, but fundamentally you know this story now. So let's talk about let's just go ahead and start with intersectionality. Intersectionality, now remember the story, the Marxist story, the social Marxist story, the cultural Marxist story, those are all synonyms. This Marxist story is basically this idea that, and it's the Darwinian story, it's the Nietzschean story, it's the Marxist story, but basically the idea is that you have survival of the fittest, you have competing groups of people or competing people, and only the strongest survive, and that's the way it is, and that's the way it should be. And anything else that you want to do to pretty that up is not true, it's just something you're making up. It's a social construct, okay? Intersectionality says that you belong. Now, everything I'm about to tell you is what this is. I'm not saying you need to believe this. I'm not even telling you this is true. There are people out there that don't believe that what I told you as a Christian story is true. Fair enough. Let's discuss it. So I'm not telling you believe this is true, but I want you to understand the implications of this. So what the intersectionality is it says all of you are basically members of certain groups. Left-handed people, people with white skin, people with black skin, people whose origin is from Mexico. There are all kinds of groupings that we fall into as people, okay? And so you are part of the class. Now, what are the ones that matter that people really want to talk about? But you get the idea. We're all part of different classes. And what's the nature of how different classes deal with each other? Struggle, competition, survival of the fittest. It's always a power game. That is the essence of this story. Everything is a power game, period. So if you have somebody in one class of people, somebody in another class of people, and you have scarce resources, somebody wants to be in charge and be telling the other group of people what to do. But intersectionality says everybody is identified in their group. Here are some of the groups. I'll just read off some that you tend to see in that is you have kind of classes of groups like this. Some are your body type. It's kind of a fat theory kind of a thing, that you can, your body type can be a class you belong to, and because of that you can be oppressed. You're discriminated against because of that. Your gender, your race, although race is a little bit different, but we say race. I'd prefer to say population or ethnicity, but whatever. Your race, your ethnicity, I said your gender, your sexual preference, your religious beliefs. All these are groups that you belong to. And some groups are more powerful than others. Let me just take men and women. Historically in America, it is a historical fact that men were treated better than women by and large. There are always exceptions, but if you want to look at groups, that men got paid more for the same job than women. Let me just use a simple example. And that's discriminatory and it's oppressive. And so that's not just an employer oppressing a woman, that's a group that you belong to, survival of the fittest, this struggle, and another group would be the women. So the men in this example, that group is the privileged group. That is the group that is in power. And the women in this example would be the group that is oppressed. This is the group that is not in power. And the only way to change that, Marx says, is what? Revolution, conflict between those two. Intersectionality starts there, and it says you're actually part of several groups, and they intersect. So for example, just to use our example, if women are a group, an identity, you identify as a woman, you identify, your identity group is a man, but then there's also true that whites and blacks in America, historically, you also have whites as a group, blacks as a group. Okay, remember, everything's groups in this story. You as an individual are not a part of this story. The whole story of social Darwinism, Nietzscheanism, and Marxism deals with groups of people, and your identity is a group. So, for example, if you are a white male, you got two groups intersecting to give you even more privilege and power. If you are a black woman, you have two oppressed groups intersecting to give you even less. Does that make sense? That's all intersectionality fundamentally is about, is looking at the intersection of your group identities, because you are part of a group, period. And looking at that intersection of those things and saying, I am way down on the totem pole or I'm way up on the totem pole. If we went to another country, I would use different examples. So I don't want you to think there's something magic about this. If we went to Saudi Arabia, we could talk Muslims and Christians. We could talk cisgendered people, heterosexuals, and homosexuals. And so if you are a Christian homosexual, you are really intersectionally in a bad class. That doesn't mean much to you and me, but in Saudi Arabia, that's how you would argue intersectionality worked there. That's fundamentally what intersectionality is it assumes everybody is part of different groups. It assumes this story that groups naturally fight one another. The only way for you to not be oppressed is to be the strongest and survive, and that means conflict of some kind or another. Just let that sink in for a minute. You should start be thinking like, oh my gosh, I know tons of people that think like this. There are tons of people who think like this, who see the world through the lens of this particular story. But intersectionality is kind of grading you on how privileged you are or how much of an oppressor you are. Let me just make this really personal. If you are in that group, you are an oppressor of the other people. And you may say, maybe you're operating out of the Christian story. Christian story says, I don't have an identity as a group of anything. I have an identity as a Christ follower, or I have an identity at worst as Terry. And they're like, that's not what this story thinks about. No, you don't. You have an identity as fill in the blank. Black woman, white male, to use our example that I've been using. And if you're in that group, you are either the victim of oppression or you are guilty of being an oppressor. I want you to understand this story. That's the way this story works. It starts in the 1800s, it comes to today, and this is what you end up with. One other thing about intersectionality, if I could add one other concept in, and that is the concept of equality and equity. This is something you will hear, it's implied more than you hear it in this story. Equality is commonly understood as the ability to have an equal opportunity. So there is no equality amongst these identity groups. If you are in an oppressor identity group, you are there is no equality with the oppressed identity group, whatever it may be, sexual preference, or whatever. Equity is the same outcomes, which is a very different thing. Equality says, I want the same opportunity. Well, there's no question, by the way, about the fact that there has been inequality. There's no question that some of this story is true, by the way, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Some of this story is very true. In other words, have there been groups of people that by and large, with some exceptions, but by and large, have not had the opportunity that other groups? Yeah, that's a fact. The question is this story the explanation for that? Is this story that it's always going to be that way, it's inevitably going to be that way, and the only way to fix that is through tension, resistance, and overthrow? Well, that's a whole other story. But as far as inequality, the second piece of that, which is often kind of slipped in there, because we're all going to agree to that. I mean, from the Christian story, we do not like inequality. We do not, because we are all created in God's image. That's our story. And so we say, well, we are all created in the image of God. And so we strive for equal opportunity. Sometimes people will slip equity in. Equity is not something that's part of very many stories at all. Equity says you got to have the same outcomes for everybody. And most of the other stories, and I'm talking about all the other stories, not just the Christian stories, are going to argue that's not part of our story. And it's not part of reality either. But that is another idea that you'll see here. So intersectionality is basically how many groups do you belong to and where does that stack you up in terms of the oppressor or the oppressed. And one key idea is you are the group you're in. That is who you are. That is how you are judged. That is what you are responsible for. It is what you are privileged for. It is what you are discriminated against for. It's not personal, it's group. So that's intersectionality. Okay? I'll trust Laura to ask any questions that come up if I haven't explained that very well. So let's talk next about critical theory. And the idea of critical theory, I'm sorry if this sounds a lot like a lecture, I just really want us to understand what's actually happening here, and this is going to make a ton of sense. Critical theory is basically the idea that group supremacy exists. In other words, it buys into the whole idea of identity groups, identity politics. Identity politics is a little offshoot of this. Everybody's part of a group. You have an identity group. In fact, intersectionality would say you're actually in several, and we kind of need to see where you stack up with the intersection of all of your identities, right? So, critical theory says there are indeed these identity groups, and supremacy exists among these. And what's even worse, supremacy is reinforced by the laws and the institutions and the social customs of your nation. That is a profound statement that has big implications. Put two and two together. If you have identity groups that are, and by the way, some of this is true, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm not making a judgment about this, I want us to understand it. If everybody's part of these identity groups, and if it's all about power, and if it's the survival of the fittest, and if the only way to correct or address that imbalance is through revolution, meaning conflict, and if the laws and the social institutions and the customs are part of that oppressive system, they also have to be overthrown. Is this making as much sense to you as it is to me? You just put piece and piece and piece together. So critical theory, and there's critical legal theory, critical queer theory, there's all kinds of theories, critical theories. You're familiar with critical race theory, but I wanted you to understand what critical theory says. So far, it has nothing to do with race, but it can be applied to race, and we call it critical race theory. It can be applied to other things, and what it's basically saying is your identity groups and the power over them are supported by laws and customs. So when you overthrow this power structure, you must also get rid of the laws and the social institutions that support them. Okay? Let that sink in for just a second. Up here on this are just some examples of intersectional groups and group identities and that kind of thing. Maybe one more quote. Actually, let me wait on that. Flip back. So questions first, and then I want to go one step further if you'll go with me on this idea.
Okay, so what do you believe is the ultimate motivation of a person or a group who adopts Darwinian or social Darwinian ideology?
What is the motivation? Okay, so I want us to step back just a minute as in be an observer of this. I don't know what the motivation is, but here's my fundamental assumption and the assumption behind the approach we're taking. Everybody's trying to make sense of their world, and everybody makes sense of their life and their world and meaning and who am I and how should I act. In other words, everybody makes sense of their world through an ideology, a story, whatever. You get the idea. I've talked to you about that. You have a lens. This lens has been taught to a lot of people that this is how you make sense of the world. So what is their motivation? Is it some people using this to manipulate other people? I suppose that's possible, but I'm not really making that accusation. I really think this is one of the stories that people use to make sense of the world. So I don't know what their motivation is. I suspect it's a matter of desperation more than it is motivation.
Is it something that is taught?
Is this something that's taught? Yes, thank you for clarifying that. Absolutely. This ideology, this story is the dominant story in universities in America today, and I would argue also in Europe today. That is not true in certain other countries. When we talk about economic Marxism in Russia and China, they don't teach this story. That's not their story. I'm going to tell you their story next week. But in America, this story is being taught all the way down into elementary schools in certain places. This is the dominant secular story in our culture today. That's why I wanted to add it in. I want to talk about Islam, I want to talk about Judaism, but this is the dominant story that's being taught in those institutions.
Are critical race theory and systemic racism the same thing?
Good question. Critical race theory and systemic racism. Let me move into this next quote. I'm going to use this quote by Carl Trueman. Some people watching, if this is your story, you may get a little mad at me here, but I'm not really trying to make you mad. I just am trying to make an observation. Just call me, we'll discuss it. Here's what Trueman said. I think he made a really good summary. He's talking about critical race theory. Critical race theory, but this could be true of any critical theory. Like other critical theories, like post-colonialism or queer theory, for example, is self-certifying. This is a big deal. Its basic claims, for example, that racism is systemic. So let me stop here and answer this question. Critical race theory, critical theory in general, intersectionality, I'm not picking on this one idea, it's a story, a way of looking at the world, that you have oppressor classes, identity groups, oppressed identity groups. Intersectionality says, oh, they interact in really weird ways. It's a Johnny-come-lately. Intersectionality only came about in the 1980s. And so, but basically you've got these structures. And not only that, the social laws and all support those structures. This story's even worse for the oppressed than you think it is. So critical race theory is that story. Systemic racism is an accusation. It is a contention of that story. So in other words, you can believe that story and say, well, there may or may not be systemic racism in America, but that's still the way the world works. But one of the things is the idea that racism is baked in to this story. In other words, and that's just racism. We're not talking about sexism. We're not talking about queer theory. We're not talking about colonial domination. All those things are their own little piece of this story. But the race piece of this story says, not only is there an oppressor class and an oppressed class, not only do the laws, let's just pick on the United States support the oppressor class, it's even worse than that. Everything in this culture is geared toward reinforcing racism. That's a statement that can be tested to be true or not be true. I mean, there'd be evidence for that. We can discuss that. But that is a contention of critical race theory. What Truman's going to say is the interesting thing about this, and this is what makes this so frustrating and why there's so much tension around this issue. Well, there's a lot of tension around this issue for many reasons, but this is one of the big ones, is that this claim that there is systemic racism, that may be true, that may not be true. I'm not taking a stand on that here. I'm just saying that is a claim. But here's what he's saying. He's saying that its basic claim, or that you could be not a racist, is impossible. And these are not conclusions drawn from arguments. They are axioms. What's an axiom? In religious terms, things you take on faith. An axiom in mathematics is something that you don't challenge. You just assume that it is true. If I said to you, there is a God, and you just have to trust that there's a God, and that's that. You just got to take it. And if you say there's not, I'm sorry, I'll lock you up. Okay? It's an axiom. You just got to accept it. He's saying that's what these kinds of claims are in that story. They're axiomatic. They're articles of faith. Now, they may be true, they may not be true. I'm going to set that aside for just a second. What I'm saying is one of the reasons there's so little discussion about this is I do not discuss my basic beliefs. In other words, it's not open for discussion. That's what Truman's saying. And I would argue that that is observably the case. I wish it were not the case, but I do believe that there's certain things that cannot be discussed. They cannot be challenged by those who do not agree with them. Those who dissent or offer criticism are by definition part of the problem. In other words, and again, I'm not saying this is true or not true. I think that's a really important discussion for us as Americans to have. And I think as Christians, we're really interested in having that discussion because we don't like systemic racism. That is not okay in our story. And we actually believe in good and evil, unlike this story, all right? So we do believe this story isn't so much its power. We don't care about the power so much as we care about its right or its wrong. We just have different stories, but we're very interested in it. So what you see happening a lot of times is if you say, wait a minute, I hear your story, but I have a question about this and I'm not sure the data supports this. There is no discussion about that. You are part of the problem. And in fact, in the critical race theory, okay, this can be applied to other areas, the fact that you think that is just proof that I'm right. You see what I'm saying? The fact that you think that I might be wrong just shows you how deeply embedded the institutions are to reinforce, in this case, racism. Does that helping you understand this? So if you thought that way and you were having a discussion with somebody who didn't think that way, how do you think that discussion goes? It really quickly gets tense and everybody gets ticked off. Voila, this explains the news. This explains the nightly news. Does that make sense? Why do you have riots by BLM? I'm going to get to Christian nationalism. Why do you have a riot at the Capitol, not by BLM? This clash in these stories and the inability to discuss some of these things is key. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm trying to explain why this is happening. What did Marx say? I think that the two different economic classes should sit down and talk things through and reach a compromise. No, that is not it. What did Darwin say? Did he say, the strongest, I really think that the lion should sit down with the gazelle and just have a discussion about what we're going to have for dinner? No. There is no discussing. It's all about power, and the only way to redress it is overthrow the other idea. It's a struggle for survival of the fittest. It's not a discussion over tea. And so I'm hoping, I'm being a little facetious, but the idea is you see why there's so much heat in these kinds of conversations. So let me summarize this for a minute. The modern secular story. Let's bring it together in a little summary story. Now you know what critical theory is, that there are oppressor groups and oppressed groups, and it's worse than that. All the laws support it. So not only do you need to overthrow the oppressor group, you also need to change all the institutions and all the laws. Have you thought about and I'm not trying to be partisan here, defund the police. I'm sorry if you like that idea, but I got to tell you, it is the perfect example of what I'm talking about here. If you say, why would somebody say defund the police? And I'm saying, I'll tell you exactly why somebody would say that. I want you to understand, if you think, and that is this story, and there are people who think this, so I'm not saying you're good, you're bad, you're right, you're wrong. I'm just trying to explain it. If you think with a critical theory that not only is there oppression, but that all the institutions of society, the courts, the police, etc., this may be true, it may not be true. That's not what I'm talking about right now. But if you thought that that was all part of this oppressive scheme, and that's how you saw the world, how do you solve it? You got to get rid of all those institutions. You got to let people out of jail. You got to get rid of the police. You have to radically change the court system. I'm simply trying to say, does that not make sense in the context of that story? Yes, it does. So if you believe that story, saying those things makes sense. Now you may say, well, I agree, I don't agree. Fine, that's not my point here. My point here is to say, do you understand why you would say that? Because this is your story. And this story says conflict and tension are inevitable and necessary. I mean, this is not a discussion. This is purely survival of the fittest. Truth is simply a viewpoint. This is called standpoint theory. Truth is simply a viewpoint, and it's relative to your identity group. Now, this is nothing like the Christian story. We believe there is such a thing as truth. It's like, no, we're postmodern. We don't think there is such a thing as truth. You have a truth, I have a truth. And your truth and my truth all come from the identity group that we are in. That's this modern secular story. Nietzsche said it this way: there are no facts, only interpretations. What's he saying? Nothing's really true. It just all depends on how you look at it. Truth just depends on what class you're in as to whether it's true or not. Well, that, unfortunately, makes it really hard to have a rational discussion, doesn't it? That's why this is a side note. If you look at the Democratic Party today, and again, I'm not making a political statement, I'm going to make an observation. Classical liberals are having a real hard time getting along with the left in that party, because classical liberals do believe in certain truths, and they may not be, they're not conservatives, but they do believe in certain truths, and they do believe you can have a dialogue, a shared dialogue. This story does not believe in dialogues. Now, if there are going to be people out there say, hey, I'm willing to talk to anybody, this story is not about dialogue. This story is about revolution. And that's what you see. Justice is not an object in itself. There are not things that are right or wrong. And this is probably what really gets you revved up when people say things. Have you ever gotten upset when you see things on television and you go, that is so hypocritical. That is such a double standard. There's no such thing in this story. In this story, justice just depends on which group you're in. So in other words, treating somebody in this group a certain way is just. Treating somebody in the oppressor group the same way is not just. In other words, why can I say that you can do something and it's okay, and you can do something and it's wrong? That just bakes a lot of your minds, doesn't it? It's like, hey, this is a double standard. This is like, no, they're in two different identity groups. Justice is not a thing in and of itself. Justice is dependent upon the power and the identity group. Again, I'm explaining to you. Now, when you hear these things, you go, oh, I know exactly why you would say that, because this is your story. This is how you think the world works. This is the worldview or the story that you are using. And then finally, moral actions, the idea of right and wrong, are judged by how they serve the oppressed groups. Give you an example. And again, I'm not arguing about whether this is good, bad, true, not true. That's another discussion to be had if there ever comes a time to have a discussion. But the point about it is, for example, discrimination is a great example of this. It's a complicated story, but at its most basic, it is discrimination is bad if you're in the oppressor group, and discrimination is a good thing if you are in the oppressed group. and I understand the argument before you say, but, I understand the argument, but all I'm observing is the obvious, and that is those two things are just or unjust depending upon who's doing it. That's all I'm saying. That's part of this story. Truth, justice, morality are not fixed things. That's the modern secular story. And I want you to think about it a little bit, because I really just want you to understand people in our country and other places who just think about this differently, and consequently they're going to say different things. They're going to do different things, and you can get pretty good at figuring out, you're doing this, that's coming from that story. And this is the modern secular story, period. So let's talk about white nationalism for a minute. No, not white nationalism, Christian nationalism, I'm sorry. White nationalism is an interesting thing to talk about too. Personal opinion, again, I'm trying to educate. I don't think white nationalism is a good thing in the Christian story. This is a very, very bad thing, okay? It's actually only bad in this story if you happen to not be white, and then it's good. Christians, bad, always bad. Christian nationalism, and what I think you mean by this, and this is a great question, is the idea of identifying my faith and my country, and let's get even more specific, a particular platform or party in my country, and saying, if Jesus were here, he'd be a Republican. I'm going to use this as an example, so I'm not trying to be inflammatory. I'm just saying, okay, suppose that's what you think, because there are people who think that, and I think that's what this question is about. Christians, you say, Christians are Republicans, and Republicans are Christians, and we are yoked together. What's good for the Republican Party is good for Christianity, okay? I may be exaggerating this a little, but that's the idea of Christian nationalism. What do I think about that? I think that you're asked an opinion, I'm going to give you an opinion. I think that's a perversion of the Christian story by bringing in an identity group into this story. The Christian story doesn't really have identity groups as part of a story. It's a very different kind of story. But I think if you take that into this, throw in a little resentment at the double standards, throw in a lack of understanding of how the other guy's thinking, and throw in a lot of anger and frustration at bad things happening to you, which everybody's got some of that. Some people more than others, but everybody's got some of that. I think then that you can move out of the Christian story and say, well, I'm going to have my own identity group, and it's going to be Christian Republicans or whatever. So that's my opinion about that. I think that is a synthesis, a reaction, an angry reaction to people feeling attacked and saying, I'm going to get an identity group, and survival of the fittest, game on. Survival of the fittest is not in the Christian story. You know, compassion for those who are weaker is in the Christian story. This is betraying, in some sense, the Christian story. So hopefully that's adequate sketching of it in this context. Yeah, question.
In this story, when is it revealed that it doesn't actually result in utopia?
So in this story, now we're getting into the evaluative phase. So what I've been trying to do is educate. Now we're going to evaluate just a little. So let me put it in this context, because I want to talk first about, and this is, in the Christian story, I think we need to understand, agree or disagree, we need to understand how people think, because people matter. You're not just a group, you're a person. I'd like to know your story. Now, obviously you can't know everybody's story, but you can know your neighbor's story. You can know a few people's story. So let's understand. And we're trying to understand a thought, a view here. Some of these things are congruent between the two stories. There are certain facts here that man's inhumanity to man. We believe in fallen world, and this story believes in oppression. We're like, yeah, I don't think I buy your story, but you and I agree on this point. People have oppressed other people. People have done horrific things to other people, right? And so we do agree on that, for example. One of the ways we part ways, and I want to use Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. I just have read two great books, and I want to recommend particularly one of them to you. The Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. is very good. I read it years ago. Obviously, it's been out a long time, and it's good. But I'll tell you something, I hadn't read this particular biography of Malcolm X until relatively recently. This book is called and I get no kickback for recommending this to you, but if you want to understand in the race world, this dichotomy. There is a big battle going on. I told you about the Democratic Party's having trouble with classic liberals and leftists, and they're not good bedfellows. The race movement is having tension around these two key ideas. The Autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. That particular book is the first-hand meetings between Malcolm X, Alex Haley, before he wrote Roots, when he's a reporter. And he writes it up, shows it to Malcolm X, he says, yep, that's my story, and publishes it. It is really good. You will not like some of it, you will disagree with a lot of it, but it is a great insight into that. Here are the two views. Martin Luther King is operating out of the Christian story. And so what Martin Luther King, I'm not trying to idealize anybody here, but basically what Martin Luther King said, nonviolence. We won't be violent to people, but we will resist, and we will speak out, and our faith will endure. Did Martin Luther King say we are an identity group? He didn't. You know, he's famous for saying, I long for the day when a man is not judged by the color of his skin, but the content of his character. That is Christian story. That is the Christ story. And yet, he's addressing a reality that we agree, man's inhumanity to man, slavery, oppression, etc. Okay, that we agree with that. Malcolm X, on the other hand, and I'm not trying to vilify him, I gain a lot of respect for this man from reading this story, but here's his ideas. He, completely the opposite. He is, we are an identity. He was a black supremacist. These are his words, not my words. I'm not accusing him of anything. He was a segregationist. Martin Luther King says we need to integrate. We just need to treat each other as individuals and forget this, my skin, your skin, I'm left-handed, you're right-handed, whatever, right? That's a Christ story. Malcolm X said, no, we are an identity group, and we need to violently struggle against this oppression. He's in this more modern secular story, and this is kind of the movement that some of the race movement has taken, is in this. He said, we need to be segregated. We do not want to mix in with the white man. The white man is the devil. Now, did he mean, and if you read this, he's going to tell you, he knows a lot of white people that aren't devils. What does he mean? He means as a group, as an identity, white man is the devil. Actually, literally, this book will blow your mind. But the point is that this is a different story, isn't it? And I think you'll see that sometimes in trying to affect race relations, you see some people operating out of what I'm going to call the Martin Luther King story or approach, and you'll see some people operating out of the Malcolm X story. And I'm not here to vilify either one. I just want you to understand you will see very different results out of those two stories. Yeah?
Where does Black liberation theology fit into this?
I didn't hear the first part, I'm sorry.
Where does Black liberation theology fit into this?
Where does Black liberation theology fit into this? And I'll go ahead and stop here, and maybe we'll carry on a little because I'm trying to be respectful of your time. This is another, the fact that you use the word theology means we're in the Christian world, okay? Black liberation theology is something that arose within the Christ story, and what I mean by that is within Christianity Incorporated. And so Black liberation theology took some of the ideas from the secular story, identity group ideas. It acknowledged the realities of injustice. I want to gloss this over. I'm not telling you that, these people that believe in Black liberation theology just all of a sudden made up something because they had a burr under their saddle. No, they're reacting to real injustice. They're reacting to real historic and entirely possibly present injustice. But the way they reacted to it, for example, was not like Martin Luther King did. They said there are groups. There is this group called Black people, an identity group, and this group has been oppressed by another group. And within the Christian world, you'll see a lot of Christian authors, white and black, who will say things like, evangelical Christianity has bought into the white man's story. Evangelical Christianity is white Christianity. And this is all coming from this context. And that is, we have two groups within Christianity. We have Black Christians, we have white Christians, and white Christians are part of the problem. And so we need to liberate Black Christians. So this is a kind of a modern secular story, if I can simplify this a little. It's kind of that modern secular story slipped into Sunday school. So it's kind of the church adopting some of that narrative and some of those stories. Mm-hmm.
You may not be ready for this question or headed there, but given this paradigm, how do we take the gospel to people who do not see right and wrong and truth?
Good question. Given this paradigm, how do we take the gospel? And we'll talk about this every week with every system that we talk about. I'd like to know, how do you take the gospel to somebody who has a Muslim story, who has a Jewish story? In this particular case, I'm going to make this argument, and I think the gospel makes this argument. I don't want to spend a lot of time arguing. I'm not saying that I necessarily, from the Christ story, I can't really agree that your identity is part of some arbitrary group. This is not part of the biblical story. I don't agree with it, but I understand that there are people that think that, so I really, instead of arguing with you about that, what I really like to talk about is this story that you're playing out. I want to talk about, I'll step back a little and say, this is what you're betting your life on. You're betting your life that this story is true. How's it going for you? And I'm not trying to be facetious here. I want to have that kind of discussion rather than the discussion of, is there systemic racism in universities or is there not systemic racism in universities? I'm very interested in discussing that because we're fact-based people. And if we can have that discussion, let's have it. But honestly, as a Christian, I'd rather have a bigger discussion, and that is, what's the story that leads to the things that you actually care about? And that is justice for everyone. Because no matter what story you have, there's a God-shaped hole inside everybody. People know that they really, really want to treat people fairly. They may be angry that they haven't been treated fairly, and they may be very rightfully angry that they haven't been treated fairly, and we need to be part of that solution. But the bigger picture is this story really going to bring peace? Is this story going to bring harmony? Is this story going to make you happy? Are you just trying to be, I'll tell you one last story here. This story is subject to this little problem. Lily Tomlin, old comedian, many of you haven't heard of her, but she told this joke one time. She said, the problem with the rat race, and you think about the rat race is the Darwinian world, the Marxist world, it's the struggle, it's the battle for who comes out on top, right? The problem with the rat race is, even if you win, you're still a rat. That's the problem that this story has to answer. Suppose I'm in the intersectionally low group. I'm a left-handed Muslim, black, okay, I'm being facetious and I'm not trying to make fun of this. But let's say I'm in a really low intersectionality group and all of a sudden I overthrow the world. I change the whole order. I change all the laws. Now my group is top dog. How long do you think you can stay at the top of the heap? Because you know what your story says? Everybody below you is gunning for you. Is this what you want to bet your life on, this story? So we'll talk more about that. That's what I want to talk about. I want to get past all the little, get in the weeds and argue and let's just get mad at each other and never settle anything. I want to say, your story, how does your story turn out? Because I want to tell you how my story turns out and then go tell your story. So, great questions. This will come up some more. We'll spend the next week also on this idea of, you'll hear this called cultural Marxism. Now you know what it is. You'll hear it called critical theory. You hear it called intersectionality, identity politics. That's all this story, and I hope that it makes sense to us. We're going to look in the next lesson at how that plays out in the political arena in Russia and China and what's going on in the world. But if you want to hold some questions, maybe we'll start with some more next time. So thanks for going overtime with me, and thanks for being so attentive. I appreciate you guys.